All right, y'all. So now let's talk about the cell or the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane, as I mentioned before, is just kind of, again, think of a membrane as like a thin skin, right? And so the plasma membrane is kind of the skin that goes around a cell, right? And it does what our skin does, protects our insides from the outside environment, right? And so here you see this is a plasma membrane, also called a cell membrane. People also call it a phospholipid bilayer. Remember, right here you see the lipid bilayer. Remember these little things right here, the heads, these yellow heads right here. Let me go ahead and outline them really quickly. So these heads right here, let me circle one. These are the hydrophilic heads, and these are the hydrophobic tails right here, right? And so remember, the heads will always face the outside, and then the tails will always tuck themselves right here in the inside. And here you see also proteins. And again, y'all, these are the four, mostly the four organic molecules that we talked about the biomolecules, right? What's missing from here is a nucleic acid. But here you see again the lipids, here you see some proteins, and proteins do different things within our plasma membranes. Here you can see this is a protein channel, so it kind of lets things go in and out of the cell. Some of these proteins are attached to carbohydrate chains. And so proteins in the cell membrane do a lot of different things, but just kind of make sure that you can identify all of the different things that are present here in this plasma membrane, right? So here again are the lipids. Here you see the proteins in this purplish color. And then here, these blue things right here are the carbohydrate chains. Right? And so again, these do a lot of different things, and it's really cool to know that they also like communicate with each other through some of these markers that they have on the plasma membrane. Right, so it's composed of a double layer of phospholipids, and we saw that right there. Here are the two layers, and then the proteins here, this purplish color, and it surrounds the outside of all the cells. Again, it's kind of like the skin of the cell. And like our skin, it controls what enters or leaves a cell, right? We don't want things getting inside of our bodies that shouldn't be there. And that's kind of what our cell does too, right? It's kind of like, or what the plasma membrane does. Make sure that things do not get in there that should not be in our cells. And so we talked about a cell wall a couple times already. Remember, y'all, the cell wall is something that you will see in not all cells, but you will see them in plant cells and in prokaryotes, right? So it's a non-living layer. It is found in plants, fungi, and bacteria, not in animals. Again, we do not have cell walls, and it supports and protects the cell, right? So kind of the extra layer of protection that we don't get because we don't have cell walls, but it prevents things from going inside the cell. And again, this is why a plant cell will never burst, is because it has that strong cell wall to keep it from bursting, even if you give it too much water, right? Our cells do not have these, and that's why you see right here, not in animal cells. And so our cells actually can burst if we have too much water in our body. Right, so the cytoplasm of the cell, kind of talked about it before, and it's just this semi-fluid in here, jelly-like, not completely liquid, a little bit thicker than liquid. But here you see all of the different organelles. That's where they live, right? So they're cushioned by that cytoplasm, and they also yeah, like I said, the jelly-like substance enclosed by the cell membrane, it provides a medium for chemical reaction. So that's what I was going to get to right now, is that if there are chemical reactions occurring in the cell, they are going to take place in this cytoplasm. And here again, this cytoplasm is just kind of this like pinkish, peachish looking thing right here, this color. And these are all the little organelles embedded in there. And so this, if you're just trying to figure out, is this a plant or an animal cell? It kind of looks a little roundish like an animal cell, but there's still a little bit of squareness to it. But the thing that really gives it away are these green organelles here. And remember, if it's green right here, these are chloroplasts, and you will find those in plant cells. So a little bit more on this, contains the organelles, right? So remember, organelles are just like our mini organs of our cell, and they just all do different types of functions, right? So these happen in the cytoplasm, found in all cells, right? So no matter whether it's prokaryote, eukaryote, plant, or animal, there will be cytoplasm within these cells. And so the control organelle or the nucleus, also called the command center of the cell, this is again what defines a eukaryote, right? You see it right here. This is a nucleus, and then the DNA will be within here. And this darker little region right here is known as the nucleolus, right? A lot of quizzes and exams won't really focus too much on the nucleolus, but make sure you do know what the nucleus is. And so it controls the normal activities of the cell. And the really important thing that you need to know about this is that it contains the DNA. Not so much, it's not so much important that you have to know it's in chromosomes or chromatin, but DNA is in that nucleus right there, right? And again, DNA is surrounded by this nuclear envelope, and it's important that it is because it is a very sensitive molecule, but it has a lot of importance to it, right? It is what determines what an organism is going to look like. Mostly, it allows for the creation of proteins, right? But again, proteins do so much for an organism's body, right? Or if it's a single cell organism, it does a lot. The DNA does. And so if that DNA gets messed up, it could lead to some diseases which would be harmful to the organism, right? So it's really important that it stays protected within this nucleus. Eventually its message has to get out. Like, what good is DNA if like its message just stays stuck in that nucleus, right? It really can't do anything. And so that's why, and this picture's kind of in the way, but these pores right here, there's little pores that kind of little holes right here. And so the DNA's message eventually gets out, and we'll talk about how that happens. But just know that the nucleus is houses the DNA. And it's usually the largest organelle. And if you ever look at this through a microscope, you can usually see this region right here. Let me try to make that a different color just so it stands out a little bit more. Let's see. This is blue one maybe. And so here you can kind of see this region right here. If you look at it through a microscope, again, that's one of the first things that stands out of a eukaryotic cell is its nucleus. And so inside the nucleus, you have this is DNA right here. And DNA, through a large portion of its life cycle, it kind of looks like this. It just kind of looks like spaghetti or thread, like someone just pulled a bunch of thread off of a spool, and it's just kind of hanging out there loosely. Right. But when you have these chromosomes right here, it's actually condensing and getting ready to split into two different we'll talk about this more, but when cells divide, they need enough DNA to go into more than just the one cell, right? So when a cell divides, you need enough DNA, so it doubles up so that it can make sure that both cells have DNA when the cell does divide. Right. And again, DNA is just the genetic material passed down from mother and father to their offspring, which is basically just the child of the parents. Right. And so that's why you look like your parents. Right. Sometimes you look a little bit like both. Sometimes you look more like one than the other. And sometimes you don't look like either. Right. Sometimes you look like your grandparents or great grandparents. And so DNA is spread out. Like I said, it's kind of thread spaghetti looking in this chromatin form. But when it's getting ready to divide, then it condenses into these thicker chromosomes right here, these guys right here, so that it can go into different cells. And we'll go into more detail when we get to mitosis and meiosis for that. So what does DNA do? Here we saw this when we talked about biomolecules, the sugar phosphate backbones, right? It's kind of this light bluish thing right here. So if you're thinking of it as a ladder, it's like those handrails that you would use to climb up the ladder. And then the bases are kind of like those rungs that you would step on, right? If you're walking up a ladder. And so those bases, they're called nitrogenous bases because they contain nitrogen. That's why it's nitrogenous. But just think of them as a basis for now. And when we get into more detail on DNA, then we'll kind of go into that nitrogenous part. But remember, y'all, adenine, thymine, A and T, cytosine, C, and G is for guanine. Remember, those two always complement each other, right? Adenine and thymine will always be together, right? AT right here, AT right here, AT right here. This is TA, but again, it's always adenine and thymine. Here you see CG, 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 GC. So complementary bases. And then remember that they're held together by this weak hydrogen bond. Right? And it's important to know that it's weak because it eventually, the DNA molecule has to split in half. So you need to be able to split them in half. And that's why it helps to have that weak hydrogen bond. So we're going to just split that in half. Right? DNA is hereditary material, which again means it's just passed down from mother and father to the offspring. And I keep saying mother and father, but remember, this also happens in plants. And so, but there is a male and a female plant, and they do produce seeds, right? And so that DNA comes from the parental generation, the parent generation. And y'all, genes, when you're thinking of genes right here, genes are basically just a section of DNA that codes for a certain protein, right? So it's a certain segment of like A's, T's, C's, and G's, and those will code for a certain protein. And proteins, again, are things that control hair color, eye color, whether you have straight hair, curly hair. So proteins do a lot of different things, and that's all determined by your genes. Again, that's why you end up having eyes like your parents, or hair like your parents, or grandparents, or great grandparents. All right, so that was the DNA, right? And everything the DNA does, it is again the genetic code for life. But now let's talk about the mitochondrion, right? The mitochondrion is, if there's one, you call it mitochondrion. If there's more than one, it's mitochondria. But the mitochondria is known as a powerhouse of the cell, right? And the powerhouse of the cell, that's they call it that because it creates energy. And when you're thinking of energy for living things, if you're doing any kind of physical activity, even if it's just like blinking your eyes or taking a breath of air, you do use energy for that. And the way your body basically pays for that the physical activities that you do is through ATP, right? So ATP, they call it the currency of the cell because if you do anything, you have to pay for it in ATP, right? But more active cells like muscle cells have more mitochondria because they do a lot more, right? And the more that those cells do, the more it makes sense for them to have a lot of mitochondria within those cells, right? So, like your muscle cells, your heart cells, different cells like that, where you have a lot of activity going on, they will have more mitochondria because it needs more of this ATP to do the activities that it has to do, right? So, both plants and animal cells will have mitochondria, and you'll see that when we get into photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is basically the reaction that happens where you intake certain substances and then certain substances are output. And so, yeah, like I was saying right here, cellular respiration, you intake glucose and oxygen and you release carbon dioxide and H2O. Right. And so, sorry, it took me a little bit. I was trying to visualize the formula. And so that is a site of cellular respiration. And that's what happens there. Right. So mitochondria, and this is what's pretty cool about mitochondria, is it comes from the cytoplasm in the egg during fertilization. Right. So the fertilization, the egg comes from the mother. Right. And because it comes from the mother, that means that your mitochondria, you inherit that from your mother. Right. So your mitochondria has DNA inside of it alongside the DNA that's already inside of the nucleus, right? But because that mitochondria was already in the cytoplasm from the mom's egg, that means a child will have the mother's DNA in that mitochondria. So, what do mitochondria do? Kind of talked about that a little while ago. The last slide called it the powerhouse of the cell. It's also known as a power plant of the cell. But again, this is where ATP is created, right? So burns glucose to release energy in ATP. And here you see ATP, y'all. And the reason it's called ATP is because it's adenosine and then triphosphate. And let me kind of spell that out right here. And remember, when you see the three letters tri means three. A tricycle has three wheels. Here you see there are three phosphates. One second, sorry, just kind of got distracted. So triphosphate. Let me get rid of this. And here you see you have one, two, three. Right. And what's really cool right here is when this molecule breaks down, you kind of break off this last phosphate right here. And energy, this is my drawing of energy, is released when this bond is broken. Right. And then it becomes adenosine. And let me change this right here. Whenever you only have the three phosphates, it's known as adenosine diphosphate, ADP. All right, but when it has all three, it is triphosphate. And here it has one, two, three. But again, when you break this one down, it releases energy. That's where your energy comes from. When you eat food, from remember all your food that you eat has glucose in it. And remember those three letters. OSE means sugar, right? But whenever you have that glucose, it's creating this triphosphate. You break down this triphosphate, energy is released, and you're able to do things with your body, right? Your body is able to do things. Remember, even taking a breath uses up energy. Right, so it stores it as ATP. And again, this is kind of, if you want to think about it, let me see if I can draw this because, again, I'm not very good at drawing with this thing. But you can kind of think of it as the currency or the money that you have to pay to do anything with your body. So next we have the endoplasmic reticulum, kind of a mouthful there, but you can call it the ER. And here we have two different types of endoplasmic reticulum. You have the smooth ER and you have the rough ER. And here we'll talk about why this is rough and why this is smooth and what each of them does. So it's a network of hollow membrane tubules. And membranes, remember, just kind of like a thin skin. And tubules, basically like tubes. And so it connects to the nuclear envelope and the cell membrane. And so you always see this when there are visuals, images of rough ER and smooth ER, they'll always be there by the nucleus. And so it functions in the synthesis of cell products and transport. And again, synthesis just means to create something. And so it helps things create things and move them around the cell. And as I mentioned, two kinds of ER. You have here the rough ER right there and the smooth one on this side. And so here we go. This is a rough ER. And the reason why it is rough is because it has all of these little ribosomes kind of studded in there, right? So these ribosomes create proteins, and these proteins, remember, created by DNA, but these proteins you can think of, sorry, these ribosomes, you can think of them as factories that create proteins, right? And they're all just embedded along this membrane. And that's what makes a rough ER rough. And so it has those ribosomes on its surface, making it rough, and it makes a membrane, proteins, and proteins for export out of the cell. So whenever you think of ribosomes, think of proteins because ribosomes are like factories for proteins. They're always being made, and that's what makes a rough ER rough are those ribosomes. Right, so proteins are made by ribosomes on the ER surface, mentioned that a couple times already, and they're threaded into the interior of the rough ER to be modified and transported. So yeah, it's just saying that those proteins are pushed into the interior of the rough ER to be modified, kind of put some finishing touches on it, and then to ship them around the cell. And so smooth ER, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, here you kind of see the rough ER, really rough looking because of all those ribosomes on there. But then you see down here, this is a lot smoother, right? There are no bumps on there because there are no ribosomes. The smooth ER lacks those ribosomes, giving it that smooth appearance. It's attached to the ends of the rough ER, right? So the rough ER is over here, but you see the smooth ER over here at the end of that. It makes cell products that are used inside of the cell, right? So you kind of imagine these like a bunch of little factories doing a lot of different things within our cell, and we need those things to happen in order to stay healthy and stay alive. It makes membrane lipids, also known as steroids, right? So that's very important to remember when you're thinking about the function of the smoothie R. Regulates calcium. That it doesn't really, we really don't stress that too much, but it is important to know, right? And then destroys toxic substances. And that is very important, right? Because you do not want toxic substances staying in your body. You want those to be broken down so that you can remain healthy. And so we talked about these guys, right? The ribosomes are like the factories that make proteins, and it's made of proteins and rRNA. And think of these again as that the factory because they do join amino acids together. And here you see all the amino acids, right? These yellow, red, green, all of these little guys right here. These are the amino acids, and they're being connected together, joined together in these long chains called polypeptides. But eventually, when you get enough polypeptides together, and they're folded in a certain way and they're put together in a certain way. Those are the proteins, right? And so here again, ribosomes are factories that make proteins. And that the process of making proteins is called protein synthesis. We'll learn about that a little more in a little bit more detail when we talk about transcription and translation. Right? So ribosomes, rough ER, again, stud that smooth surface. A lot of times, though, ribosomes don't necessarily have to be attached to the rough ER. Sometimes they can just be unattached in the cytoplasm, right? And they're just kind of hanging out there without having to be attached to the rough ER. But again, whenever you see ribosomes, think proteins. So these Golgi bodies, yeah, they kind of look like stacks of flattened sacks, kind of like pancakes smushed down, right? And so these have a shipping side, which is called the transphase, and the receiving side, which is called the cisphase, right? So what's really cool about these is the Golgi bodies. Sometimes it's called the Golgi apparatus. It's a lot simpler to call it a Golgi body, but either one is correct, right? It receives proteins made by the ER, by the endoplasmic reticulum. And transport vesicles are modified proteins, and it pinches off the end. So what's really cool is it is kind of creating like little vehicles for all of these molecules to float around in the cell, right? And it transports them. I always think of like a little factory that does the finishing touches on something before it ships it out, right? And so remember that the Golgi bodies will create these little transport vesicles, basically made of lipids, and it allows things to transport themselves around the cell. Right. And so here you see one of these little transport vesicles. You can think of it as a little vehicle or a little car or a little truck that moves things around the cell. Right. And like it says right here, it pinches off to the sides right there. So, like, pinch it off right there, and then it kind of pinches off right there. And so they do look like a stack of pancakes, right? Kind of flattened down. And they modify, sort, and package. Kind of like I said, put the finishing touches. And here you can kind of see like a little box on a conveyor belt. Modifies, sorts, and packages molecules from ER for storage or transport out of the cell. Right. So again, it puts the finishing touches, creates these little vesicles, and it allows molecules to move around, all these little chemicals to move around inside the cell, and even to be shipped out of the cell. And so materials are transported from the rough ER to the Golgi to the cell membranes by vesicles. Right. And so you kind of see a picture of the Golgi body. It looks like flattened sacks or smushed down pancakes. And it does, like it says here, transport from the rough ER. And here you see all these little ribosomes, which are supposed to be, which makes it rough. Right. And then it transports it out to the Golgi body. And then it either comes back into the cell. Let me kind of make this arrow a little bit better. And then it comes here to the Golgi body and either gets shipped out of the cell right here, or it'll just kind of stay within the cell. But it creates these vesicles. And I always think a vesicle vehicle, right? Kind of similar sounding.